This video is kind of an overview of industrial sites in the town of Hanson from the late 1600s till right now in the around 2011. Most of the industry has disappeared. The town has become more or less a bedroom community. The only industries left in town operating right now are the light control plant on Parks Avenue, and there's half a dozen machine shops located around town. There were 3 gasoline-powered sawmills that started like in the 1940s, but they've discontinued around 1960. They were owned by the late Bud Beauregard, the late Clifton Locke, and the late Milton Clark. But those are all gone by now, and there's nothing operating now like that. So that's pretty much the story of industry up to this point. In 1660, much of the area that's comprised of the present town of Hanson was purchased from the Indians by Major Thomas from Marshfield, and it was referred to as the Major's Purchase. This was in 1660. The area had been Indian territory before that, so none of the timber on it was harvested. It was all virgin timber. So around 1680, they put a dam across the Indian Head River out here and built a crude house halfway up the hill, and they began work on building the mill. It was called the Thomas Mill, and by the late 1600s it was turning out sawed timber from the surrounding forests. They were mostly oak and pine, so the oak went to shipbuilding and the pine of course went to building houses and barns. It was in the Thomas family for many, many years. It burned, it was rebuilt, the pond was enlarged. It ran as a sawmill until the early 1800s, and then there was nail making machinery put in, and it was an ironworks part of the time, I guess, as well as a sawmill. The last time it was used as a sawmill was 1926, and on the 4th of July, 1926, it burned to the ground. Kind of interesting timing, I'd say. The lot sat empty for many years. The dam was used by the Cranberry Company to flood the bogs that are upstream, and the pond remained. Around 1970, as a bicentennial project, why the town undertook the construction of a building on the site of the mill. Of course, it's not an exact reproduction, but it's a reflection of what may have been here in the early days. It was a crew of volunteers, myself included. The timbers were all hewed by hand, and most of the construction is similar. The boarding and everything is something that would have been built in the 1800s. There's a water wheel out here which was vandalized. It's now being repaired. It's not hooked to any machinery, but The mill building is used for gatherings and civic affairs. It's hoped that the ground can be landscaped and fixed up a little nicer, but in 2010, the town, which had previously leased it, purchased the property. So now it is the property of the town. So anything that can be done here, the town is responsible for, and they have control over it. They also have control over the water rights to Wampatuck Pond. The land in this area was purchased by Theodosius Moore. He built the house over behind me here, and they built a mill and dam on the Four Meadow River right here, right where the riffle was there. And by the mill was built around 1704 and produced lumber from the surrounding forest. It burned, and then later was rebuilt as an ironworks. And then it was a grist mill, an ironworks, and a sawmill. The buildings collapsed and disappeared in the 1920s. The road used to run a lot closer to the dam, and it was moved this way here. In the 1800s, there was a pond behind the dam, and there was an ice house on the pond, and they used to cut and sell ice from the pond. Owned by Joe White, the horse trader that lived up the road here. Four Meadow River does not have much of an elevation drop, so this is the only mill in Hanson that was on Four Meadow River. The next one upstream was in Whitman. Okay, looking down the river, you can see there was all stonework done along this side to contain the river, and the house is over there. And the stonework was rebuilt when the water mains were put through. In this location there was a pond, a small dam and a pond. Later, when they put the water main through, they drained the pond. So here, there's nothing but a brook here right now. In the 1800s, the early settlers, discovering that there was perhaps a 12-foot drop between Stetson Pond and Pembroke and East Monpont Lake, which is to my left, a small brook came through here called Stetson Brook. Not too many people know about it. There was a sawmill, an active sawmill on the site, and when the railroad came through around 1840, they ran the railroad right across the mill dam. I think at that time, the mill probably disappeared. I'm not sure when it ceased operations, but it must have been the late 1800s. There's an upper Chandler Mill Pond, and then it drops here into cranberry bogs. The cranberry industry rebuilt this dam. As you can see, there's elaborate water control structures here. Okay. If you wanted, you can... This is the Stetson Cemetery. It was probably started around 1800. I believe it's almost an acre in extent, but we don't really know exactly where the boundaries are. A number of people that from the area were buried here. Of course, the mill was over there, and the Monpont settlement was over there, and Plymouth Street was behind me in Pembroke. So I suppose that this was probably the road that went between the two. It was cleared out a couple of times, most recently 2 years ago by a Boy Scout troop, and they put the fence around it and cleared all the underbrush around it. A few years ago, we put stones in commemoration of 2 Revolutionary War veterans that are buried here, and I believe there's a couple more that have been documented as being buried here. We haven't got stones for them yet, but this was part of the settlement surrounding the old mill, the Chandler Mill that was on the brook here. This area, which is on the brook that flows from McQuon Pond into Indian Head Pond, is known as the Marcus-Uran Fisherman's Landing. It's owned by the Conservation Commission. They have a right-of-way that goes out to Indian Head Street. People can come here and launch boats in Indian Head Pond, which is on my right here. When they first arrived here, they discovered that there were iron nodules on the bottom of Indian Head Pond and several of the ponds in Pembroke. So they would take a barge and they would go out in the pond with something that looked like oyster tongs, and they would reach down and they'd scoop these nodules from the bottom of the pond. They'd bring them to a blast furnace and they'd smelt them into iron, and of course that was what they used for making hinges and tools and pots and pans and nails, because of course the iron imported from England is very expensive. So that gave them the opportunity to do it here. But McQuon Pond is clear. Indian Head Pond has a lot of iron in it, and of course the bottom was covered with nodules. This industry stopped in the late 1800s when iron ore was discovered in the western part of the country. So they no longer had a need for it because it was easier. But it really flourished around here for quite a while. Walk down there out of the pond. Give me the word. This is Indian Head Pond on the border between Hanson and Pembroke. Across the pond there, you're looking at the town of Pembroke. As you can see, the water is not all that clear. But the bottom, as I say, was covered with iron ore. So it was good for iron, but it wasn't much good for drinking or swimming. Okay, this is State Street. We're at the Indian Head River at the Hanson-Hanover line. Hanover's this way, Hanson is this way. The Indian Head River drops quite steeply from its origin in Weymouth down to the ocean. So many people decided that this was an excellent spot for a water-powered mills. By the mid-1800s, there was a great factory complex covering both sides of the river here. There was sawmills and ironworks. There was an anchor forge, which I think was on the Hanover side, tack factory, all kinds of industry. And a lot of it was owned by a gentleman named E.Y. Perry. There was great contention over his estate. I don't know if it's been settled to this day. Everyone up and down State Street and then this main street in Hanover all worked at this complex. And on the Hanover side there was a railroad station that was connected to the old colony. So it was quite an operation. And the dam the buildings burned or were taken down, and the dam has been pretty well breached. And now there's pretty much just woods here to tell you what was going on here many years ago. Give you a little history here. Tell me when. As you can see where the water is falling, this is the remains of the dam that used to impound the river at this point. But in interest of flood control, the dam has been pretty well removed. It allows the fish to come up further along the river than they would be able if the dam was there. This building is the last mill on this site. Probably there have been 3 or 4 previous to it. On the 1830s map, the building is listed as a cotton and a woolen mill. I suspect, though, earlier it was a sawmill and it was a tack factory. At some point, the old wheel was replaced with a turbine. A machine shop with overhead belts operated in this building by the late Eddie Lundberg. It was still operating when I came to read the meter in the 1950s. It's the last use of water power in town, as far as I know. Ice house was built on the south end of the pond, and ice was cut. The building was behind number 563 East Washington Street. It fell down, but one of the walls was still standing in 1960. The pond was polluted by mercury from the national fireworks up the stream, so they still haven't resolved it. The dam was repaired about 10 years ago, and it still maintains a level of the pond. You're looking across the pond, you're looking into the town of Hamilton. This is the mill race where the turbine was located in that pit right there. I don't know when it was removed, but there's still a mighty good flow of water here. They probably power a generator with it. I'll look up there. This was where the ice house used to be. There was there's still a foundation hidden amongst the trees. But this spot was one of the later impoundments of the Indian Head Brook that flows out of Wampatuck Pond. There was a mill on this spot. It's listed as being a tack factory, and I'm sure they made nails and shoe tacks here. It was gone by the time I came along. The road was rebuilt in the 1980s. There's not much left of the old dam. The river flows freely under Brook Street at this point. This house was built by the people that ran the mill, and it was used, and I believe it was fairly long. I believe it was used as quarters for some of the workers as well as the owner of the mill. beyond this field and beyond that woods, there was a body of water called Cushing's Pond. It was owned by the Cushing family and dammed up in the late 1800s, probably around the time of the Civil War. They had a tack factory operating on the dam that impounded the pond. It was known for years as an excellent duck pond. Things deteriorated and the pond went out pretty much by the late 1930s. In the 1950s, the dam was re-erected and the water level of the pond started to come up. Then we had quite a sizable rainstorm, and at that time, the dam went out again, and it's never been put back. And of course, the need for the dam is evaporated since there's no need for the water power, and this water runs downstream to the Tannery Pond on West Washington Street. It was owned by late Joe White. There's pictures in the historical booklet of people plowing the field here, and you can see the pond beyond. This house was the home, tell me when. This house was the home of the Cushing family that operated the mill. Is the site of the first steam-powered mill in Hanson. It was started by Luther Keene and a couple of other people, and they used it to saw railroad ties in the 1840s for the new railroad that came through here. Also, they would saw posts and rails. It was bought in the 1860s by John Foster. He expanded it into a large sawmill and box factory. After a couple of fires, the business scaled back to a retail lumber yard in 1936, run by Alfred Pillsbury. It was sold and closed in the 1960s. The name lives on at a store in Marshfield. This chimney here there was a chimney originally and a steam generating plant to run the sawmill. There was originally an iron chimney here. This chimney was built in the late 1930s. I'm not sure if there's any reason for it to be here now, except that it's really expensive to tear it down. This area off this way, Larry over this way, was the area where the Foster box factory was located. There's a new building built on the spot that has changed owners a couple times. The original store building is over here, but it's been empty for quite a few years. Don't know what's going to become of the property, but it was once a bustling industrial hub. They harvested pine locally, and they used it to build boxes, wooden boxes for the shoe industry. And it was a very thriving business until they came up with cardboard. The original part of this block, in the middle, the brick portion, was a building built in 1909 by Friends Baked Beans Company. It was purchased in 1910 by Marcus Uran to use as a cranberry packing plant. He was a lawyer from Maine, and decided to grow us into a cooperative, which later became Ocean Spray. He kept building and expanding on both sides of the railroad tracks until he had a fully operating plant producing sauce and cranberry cocktail, plus frozen berries and concentrate. He died around 1970. The plant continued here until the early 1990s. And at which point it closed and was moved to Middleborough and Lakeville. This plant formerly employed hundreds of people in this area, one of the major employers. Besides the cranberry products, they also made cranberry boxes. Mr. Rand did lots of civic things on behalf of the town. The Kiwanis Club met in this building and he organized parties for the kids at Christmas time. The Ocean Spray brand is now known worldwide. It all began right at this spot. From the mid-1700s until the Civil War, many families had in the farmyard a small shoe shop like this one here. Family members made shoes during winter when farm work was slow. The finished shoes could be picked up by a merchant who would often supply leather, nails, and thread. During the Civil War, production was shifted to large factories in Bridgewater, Whitman, and Brockton. Many of those families went to work there. See inside, Larry, show the tools. You can see the old sewing machine in the corner, which would have been used for making both shoes and harness. A lot of the old shoe tools are on the walls and on the benches. They would come out here and probably have a little stove, and in the wintertime it was a good place to get out of mother's hair out of the kitchen. Good place to spend the day in the wintertime. This was the heart of the Barrage industrial area. This is Fox Avenue here. Across the road, the tracks over here was where the railroad station was located. The building behind it with the red roof was the post office. And across the way where that house is, there was a store. Behind me, over here, Larry, behind that fence was a brick building, which was used as the dye works, and an annex to it produced shell casings for World War I. There was over here there was a foundation which was used by the Cranberry Company and later rebuilt into a processing plant by Cumberland Farms, and it was later purchased by the state and used, and now it's part of the Barrage Pond Wildlife Area. The building was completely destroyed. This building here most recently burned about 30 years ago, and the site is now owned by Light Control. Looking in that direction is the Barrage Pond Wildlife Area. And when Barrage formerly owned that, and he decided that he was going to build a power plant and water pumping station down there. And he built them, and his intention was to burn peat to power the steam equipment. That was not practical, so he ran a railroad siding down there. Later on, when Cumberland Farms developed bogs, they destroyed most of the tank and so forth, but the foundation of the power station, solid concrete, about 30 feet square and 12 feet high, was too much, and it still sits there. Can be seen to this day when you stroll down through the Barrage Pond area. This building, which is now Light Control, manufactures lighting fixtures, mainly for offices. It formerly operated as Wheeler Reflector Company, making fluorescent reflectors. And then it was previous to that, it was a work manufacturing company that made reflectors and insulators, and did and coating things with porcelain enamel. The area between the buildings was where the railroad siding used to go. It went down to the pumping station. This is the last remaining industrial property in Hanson that still employs any number of people. At its height, it probably employed as many as 300 to 400 people. And a lot of the people came up by train from Plymouth to work here. Barrage also built many of the houses along Reed Street and Pleasant Street for the workers to live in. The plant has scaled back in the last few years. Larry, somebody coming up behind you. And they've also opened a plant in Plimpton, manufacturing the same things. But this place, as far as I can see, is still going strong in October 2011. This area is now the Barrage Pond Wildlife Area. It originally started off, behind those trees is the light control factory, which Mr. Barrage started. And this was the swamp. He built, down here in the swamp, he built a steam generating plant and a pumping station. And that's remained right there. And over here, the pile of weeds is the settling tank for the pumping station. His idea was to provide water for his factory and electricity and steam. He originally intended to mine peat out of the swamp. That did not work out. So instead he ran a railroad siding down to this point and delivered coal to this plant so they could operate. Later on, electricity became available. He built a steam boiler in the factory, and for water he hooked onto the Brockton water system. So this area became obsolete. It sat here for many years. Further down he built a 50-acre cranberry bog, which is one of the largest in the area. There was another couple of smaller bogs up here. Bogs for many years. Later, Mr. Uran sold the property to Cumberland Farms. Cumberland Farms developed all the swamp in this area, probably 400 acres total, into cranberry bogs. Cumberland Farms sold out to Northland Cranberries, who ran the bogs, improved the bogs, and a few years ago, Northland Cranberries sold to the Department of Fisheries and Game, who established this as a wildlife preserve. This land extends into Halifax in this direction, goes to East Bridgewater in that direction, and encompasses a good deal of the southern part of the town of Hanson. The state's intention is to keep it as pretty much open grassland, because it's a favorite stop for migrating birds, and it's an excellent spot to see wildlife. There's many paths here which you can even traverse on foot or by bicycle. Good spot for wildlife viewing. And I don't believe that you'll ever see any industry here from here on. That's it. across the street, steel frame building, built sometime in the 1930s. It was owned by Edgar Failton, and they harvested cedar from the cedar swamps. They cut it up, peeled the bark off, and made shavings for dog bedding. It operated until the 1970s. They would blow all the shavings, the bark out back, and bale the shavings, and the building finally closed in the 1970s.
Okay.
This was the last use of native cedar in this area, other than for posts. This area was formerly occupied by the North Hanson Depot and Copeland's Feed and Grain. The buildings were cleared out and the railroad station abandoned. In the early 1950s, the late Louis Goodwin built a cement block building on this site and manufactured porcelain-coated light fixtures to compete with Wheeler reflectors in Southern California. In the 1960s, the building burned and sat empty for a while. The building was used to manufacture porcelain enamel light fixtures. It burned in the late 1960s and was abandoned, and then the late Charles Earl founded a feed and grain store on this spot. And it's been expanded to a certain extent these times. It continues as a feed and grain store to this day, October 2011.